In the bitter winter of 1867, when the Missouri Ozarks lay blanketed beneath 3 feet of snow and the mountain passes were treacherous enough to claim the lives of even experienced travelers, 2 men who called themselves Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell operated a modest roadside cabin that served as both sanctuary and slaughterhouse for those unfortunate enough to seek shelter within its log walls. The brothers had arrived in the remote hollows during the chaos of the Civil War, when questions about a man's past were considered impolite, and the forged papers they carried were accepted without scrutiny by neighbors who had learned that survival often required willful ignorance about the origins of mysterious strangers drifting through the war-torn frontier. Their cabin sat at the intersection of 2 mountain trails that connected Springfield to the Arkansas settlements, positioned precisely where exhausted travelers would be most desperate for food, warmth, and safe lodging before attempting the final dangerous stretches of their journeys. The structure itself appeared unremarkable, a single-story log building with a stone chimney that sent welcoming smoke signals into the frigid air, split rail corrals for travelers' horses, and outbuildings that suggested the honest industry of frontier farmers trying to scratch a living from the unforgiving Ozark soil. But beneath the facade of rustic hospitality, Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley, the brothers' real names, which they had abandoned along with their previous lives in Kentucky, had discovered that isolated travelers carried valuable possessions and told no tales if they never reached their intended destinations. What had begun as opportunistic robbery during their first winter in the mountains had evolved into a systematic murder operation that combined their knowledge of poison with the calculated precision of experienced killers who understood that their remote location provided perfect cover for crimes that would never be investigated by overwhelmed frontier law enforcement. The transformation from desperate fugitives to methodical predators had occurred gradually, starting with their first victim in December 1864. Margaret and Samuel Hendricks, traveling west with their 8-year-old son David, had sought shelter during a blizzard that made further travel impossible until the storm passed. The family appeared prosperous, with well-made clothing, sturdy wagons, and horses that suggested substantial resources backing their journey to establish a new life in California. Ezekiel, the older brother at 34, possessed the calculating intelligence that made him the architect of their murder schemes, while 28-year-old Joshua handled the social interactions that lured victims into their web of false hospitality. Joshua's boyish charm and apparent concern for travelers' welfare masked a complete absence of empathy that allowed him to serve poisoned refreshments while maintaining conversations about their victims' hopes and dreams for their new lives in the territories. "Welcome, friends," Joshua had greeted the Hendricks family as they struggled through the cabin door, their clothing crusted with ice and their faces blue with cold. "You look half frozen to death. Come sit by the fire while I heat some water for washing and prepare something warm for your bellies. My brother Elias and we understand the hardships of the trail, and no Christian souls will suffer in our house when we have means to provide comfort." The family had gratefully accepted the offered hospitality, warming themselves before the stone hearth, while Joshua bustled about preparing what appeared to be a simple meal of cornbread, salt pork, and hot coffee. But the pewter cups from which they drank their welcome water had been treated with arsenic that Ezekiel had carefully measured to ensure death would come slowly enough that victims would not immediately associate their symptoms with the refreshments they had consumed. Ezekiel watched from the shadows as the Hendricks family began showing signs of arsenic poisoning. Initially, nothing more concerning than slight nausea and fatigue that could easily be attributed to exhaustion from travel. But as the evening progressed, their symptoms intensified into violent cramping, uncontrollable vomiting, and the characteristic burning sensation in throat and stomach that marked arsenic's deadly progress through their systems. "Please," "Help us," Margaret Hendricks had pleaded as she writhed in agony on the cabin floor, her son crying beside her while Samuel convulsed with seizures that would soon claim his life. "Something is terribly wrong. We need a doctor. Our boy. Please don't let our boy die like this." But no help had come, and by morning 3 more souls had joined the growing collection of victims whose remains would fertilize the Ozark soil around the brothers' property. Ezekiel and Joshua had spent their first lesson in murder learning how to dispose of bodies in ways that would prevent discovery, how to sort through victims' possessions for items worth keeping versus those too distinctive to retain safely, and how to clean blood and other evidence from their cabin's interior so thoroughly that subsequent victims would suspect nothing. The success of their first murders had taught the brothers that their isolation provided perfect cover for systematic predation, while their victims' diverse origins meant that no single community would notice a pattern of disappearances. Travelers on frontier trails often faced legitimate dangers, whether wild animals, bandits, accidents, disease, that provided ready explanations for why someone might disappear between settlements without arousing suspicion that they had encountered something more sinister than natural hazards. Over the following months, the brothers refined their methods with each new victim, learning to read travelers' body language and possessions to determine how much resistance they might offer, how much wealth they carried, and whether their disappearance would prompt extensive searches by family members or authorities. Single men traveling alone presented the lowest risk, while families with young children provided the greatest emotional challenges, but also the most valuable possessions. Joshua developed particular skill at engaging victims in conversations that revealed crucial details about their backgrounds, destinations, and the likelihood that someone would come searching if they failed to arrive at their intended location. His genuine interest in their stories and apparent empathy for the hardships they had endured made travelers eager to share intimate details about their lives, never suspecting that this information would be used to assess their suitability as victims. "Brother," Joshua would say to Ezekiel, after particularly promising travelers had bedded down for the night, "The merchant from St. Louis carries at least $200 in gold coins, judging by the weight of his money belt. Claims he has no family expecting him in Little Rock, just business associates who won't worry if he's delayed by weather." And that cough of his would explain sudden illness that might prove fatal. Ezekiel's role involved the more technical aspects of their operation, preparing poisons in doses calculated to achieve specific effects, planning disposal methods that would minimize evidence, and maintaining the careful records that allowed them to track their victims' possessions and ensure that valuable items were sold in markets far enough away to prevent connections being drawn to their activities. The brothers' background provided perfect preparation for their new career in murder. Joshua's brief employment as an assistant to a Kentucky physician before his dismissal for stealing laudanum had given him basic knowledge of human anatomy and the effects of various substances on the human body, while Ezekiel's experience working in his uncle's butcher shop had taught him efficient methods for processing carcasses and preserving meat for long-term storage. By the end of 1865, the brothers had perfected a routine that rarely failed to deliver victims into their hands. Travelers arriving at their cabin would be welcomed with apparent genuine warmth, offered refreshments that contained carefully measured doses of poison, and engaged in friendly conversation while the toxic substances took effect. Those who died quickly had their possessions sorted immediately, while victims who lingered in agony were dispatched with smothering or blunt force trauma that Ezekiel administered with clinical efficiency. The disposal of bodies had evolved from crude burial in the woods to sophisticated methods that minimized evidence while maximizing the usefulness of remains. The brothers had constructed a smokehouse behind their cabin where they preserved certain cuts of human flesh alongside legitimate game meat, discovering that properly prepared Human meat could sustain them through harsh winter months when hunting was difficult and supply trips to towns were risky due to weather and potential scrutiny from authorities. What had begun as desperate measures for survival had gradually transformed into preference, with both brothers developing tastes for human flesh that they satisfied through their systematic predation on travelers. Their victims provided not only immediate wealth in the form of money, jewelry, weapons, and valuable possessions, but also long-term sustenance that reduced their dependence on outside communities and further decreased the likelihood that their activities would be discovered. As 1866 progressed into 1867, the Hartley brothers, operating as the Stillwells, had claimed the lives of dozens of travelers whose disappearances were attributed to the normal hazards of frontier travel rather than the calculated malevolence of predators who had turned hospitality into a weapon. Their success had bred confidence that would ultimately contribute to their downfall. But during the winter of 1867, they remained convinced that their remote location and careful methods had made them untouchable by any authority that might eventually question the remarkable number of people who simply vanished after passing through their section of the Ozark wilderness. Between the autumn of 1865 and the fateful winter of 1867, the Hartley brothers transformed their isolated cabin into an efficient murder factory, where systematic killing became as routine and methodical as any other frontier industry, with each new victim teaching them refinements in technique that made subsequent murders more reliable and less likely to leave evidence that could connect them to their crimes. Their evolution from opportunistic killers to sophisticated predators reflected both their natural intelligence and their complete absence of moral constraints when it came to exploiting the vulnerability of desperate travelers, seeking nothing more than basic shelter from the brutal Ozark winters. Ezekiel had become the operational mastermind behind their murder enterprise, developing an array of poisons and toxic substances that could be tailored to specific victims and circumstances. His collection included arsenic for slow, seemingly natural deaths that could be attributed to illness, strychnine for quick, violent ends when speed was more important than stealth, laudanum and other opiates for overdoses that would appear accidental, and various plant-based toxins that grew wild in the Ozark forests and could be harvested without leaving purchasing records in town. Apothecaries. The brothers maintained meticulous records of their experiments with different poisons, noting dosages, delivery methods, onset times, and victim reactions in a ledger that Joshua kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in their cabin's main room. Each entry provided data that improved their efficiency with subsequent victims, turning murder into a science where variables could be controlled and outcomes predicted with increasing accuracy. Entry dated March 15, 1866. Reed, merchant from Memphis, age approximately 45. Weight perhaps 160 pounds. 3 grains arsenic in evening coffee. Symptoms began within 1 hour. Death occurred approximately 6 hours after administration. Victim complained of stomach burning but did not suspect poisoning. Method effective for middle-aged travelers. Note, increased dosage for larger men to ensure complete effect. Another entry from July 1866 documented family of 4, parents and 2 children ages 8 and 12, whose strychnine in water served upon arrival due to suspicious behavior from father. All victims dead within 30 minutes. Method too rapid for natural illness appearance, but necessary due to father's military background and obvious weapons training. Disposed bodies in separate locations to prevent discovery of multiple victims. The brothers had also developed different approaches based on their assessment of each victim's background, resources, and likelihood of being missed by family or business associates. Wealthy merchants traveling alone received the most careful treatment, with slow-acting poisons that would allow time for natural-seeming illness symptoms to develop. While suspicious or potentially dangerous, travelers were dispatched quickly with fast-acting toxins that eliminated the risk of armed resistance. Joshua's role had evolved into a sophisticated performance of rustic hospitality that could be calibrated to each victim's expectations and psychological profile. He had learned to read travelers' clothing, equipment, speech patterns, and mannerisms to determine their social class, regional origins, and probable wealth, allowing him to tailor his approach to maximize their comfort and trust while gathering intelligence about their backgrounds and destinations. For prosperous-appearing victims, Joshua would emphasize his family's respectable frontier origins and their commitment to Christian hospitality, often sharing fabricated stories about their parents' settlement of the area and their own service during the war. For rough-looking travelers who might respond better to a more casual approach, he would present himself as a fellow wanderer who understood the hardships of the trail and the importance of helping strangers who found themselves in difficult circumstances. The psychological manipulation extended beyond simple conversation to include carefully staged evidence of legitimate business activities around their property. The brothers maintained a small vegetable garden, kept a few chickens and a milk cow, and even occasionally sold surplus produce to neighbors to establish their reputation as hard-working settlers rather than idle men whose income might be questioned by observant travelers. Their most sophisticated deception involved the creation of false identities for previous victims, complete with personal belongings and invented backstories that could be shared with new arrivals to explain the presence of valuable items that obviously hadn't belonged to poor frontier farmers. A gold pocket watch might be explained as an inheritance from Joshua's grandfather, while expensive clothing could be attributed to gifts from their sister who had married well and moved to St. Louis. The smokehouse behind their cabin had become the centerpiece of their disposal operation, equipped with custom modifications that allowed for efficient processing of human remains alongside legitimate game meat. The brothers had learned to butcher human bodies with the same systematic approach they applied to deer and wild hogs, sorting cuts based on quality and intended use while ensuring that bones and other identifiable remains were disposed of through methods that would prevent discovery even if authorities conducted thorough searches of their property. Ezekiel had developed particular expertise in meat preservation techniques that could maintain edible human flesh for extended periods, experimenting with different combinations of salt, smoke, and chemical preservatives to create products that were both nutritious and palatable. His notes indicated genuine pride in achieving results that satisfied their nutritional needs while maintaining the secrecy essential to their operation. The psychological transformation of both brothers was documented through Joshua's increasingly clinical entries in their victim ledger. Early murders had been accompanied by expressions of regret or justification, with comments about desperate circumstances that forced them to extreme measures. But by 1867, their entries read like business records, with victims reduced to collections of assets and disposal challenges rather than human beings whose lives had been ended for profit. Entry from October 1866. 2. Soldiers returning from service in Kansas, carrying military pay and equipment worth approximately $80 total. Both men experienced in combat but suffering from dysentery that weakened resistance. Used arsenic in medicinal tea offered for their condition. Deaths appeared natural continuation of existing illness. Buried weapons and uniforms separately from bodies. Kept boots and money. Another entry from January 1867 demonstrated their complete desensitization to their victim's humanity. Widow woman traveling with teenage daughter. Destination unknown, but carrying substantial jewelry and household goods. Applied strychnine to both victims in evening meal due to cold weather making disposal easier. Young woman provided excellent quality meat for smoking. Older woman's belongings suggest Philadelphia origins. Must sell jewelry in distant market to avoid recognition. The brothers had also developed contingency plans for various scenarios that might threaten their operation. They maintained escape caches of money, weapons, and false identity papers hidden in multiple locations around their property, along with detailed knowledge of routes that could take them quickly into Arkansas or the Indian Territory if they needed to disappear rapidly. Their preparations included arrangements with Confederate sympathizers who operated networks helping war. Fugitives and deserters established new identities in frontier communities where questions about the past were discouraged. By the winter of 1867, their systematic predation had claimed at least 70 victims, whose disappearances had been attributed to the normal hazards of frontier travel rather than calculated murder. The brothers had accumulated substantial wealth in the form of money, jewelry, weapons, and other valuable possessions, while their smokehouse contained preserved human meat sufficient to sustain them through multiple winter months without requiring supply trips to nearby settlements. Their confidence in their methods and location had grown to the point where they were taking increasingly brazen risks, keeping victims' possessions that should have been disposed of immediately, and allowing their success to breed carelessness that would ultimately lead to their exposure. But during their peak period of operations, the Hartley brothers had created one of the most efficient and successful murder enterprises in American criminal history, turning their remote cabin into a death trap that claimed victims with industrial efficiency while maintaining a facade of Christian hospitality that never aroused suspicion from the few neighbors who might have been positioned to observe their activities. The systematic nature of their crimes, combined with their evolution from desperate fugitives to sophisticated predators, represented a form of evil that frontier communities were unprepared to recognize or combat, making their eventual exposure all the more shocking when the full scope of their activities finally came to light through discoveries that would haunt the Ozark region for generations. Among the 73 souls who entered the Hartley brothers' cabin of death during their reign of terror between 1864 and 1867, only 3 managed to escape with their lives, carrying with them evidence and testimony that would eventually expose one of the most systematic murder operations in American frontier history. These survivors, Sarah Mitchell, William Torres, and James Crawford, encountered the brothers at different times and under different circumstances, but each possessed some combination of intuition, experience, or pure fortune that allowed them to recognize danger and escape before the poison could claim their lives. Sarah Mitchell, a 26-year-old widow from Independence, Missouri, had been traveling to Arkansas in September 1866 to claim land inherited from her deceased husband's military service when an early autumn storm forced her to seek shelter at the Stillwell cabin. Her survival depended on keen observation skills developed during years of managing her late husband's business affairs, combined with rural upbringing that had taught her to recognize signs of predatory behavior in both humans and wild animals. Upon arriving at the cabin, during a torrential rainstorm that had turned the mountain trails into treacherous streams of mud and loose rock, Sarah had been welcomed by Joshua with his characteristic display of Christian hospitality. But something in his manner, too eager, too insistent on her comfort, too interested in details about her traveling companions and destination, had triggered instincts that warned her of deception beneath his seemingly genuine concern for her welfare. Come in, dear lady," Joshua had urged as she stood hesitating in the doorway, her traveling dress soaked through and her hair plastered against her skull by the driving rain. "You'll catch your death standing out there in this weather. My brother and we've got hot coffee brewing and a warm place by the fire where you can dry your things while this storm passes through." But as Sarah entered the cabin and began warming herself before the stone hearth, she noticed details that contradicted the brothers' presentation of themselves as simple frontier farmers struggling to make ends meet in the harsh Ozark wilderness. The pewter cups and plates appeared too fine and numerous for a household of just 2 men, while clothing items hanging on pegs near the door included garments obviously sized for women and children rather than the tall, Lean brothers who claimed to be the cabin's only occupants. Most significantly, Sarah observed human bones mixed among the animal bones scattered around the property's refuse areas, including what appeared to be finger bones and teeth that had been cleaned and broken in ways that suggested intentional disposal rather than natural decomposition. Her late husband had been a physician, and her assistance with his medical practice had taught her to recognize human skeletal remains and distinguish them from animal bones of similar size. When Joshua offered her a cup of water, drawn from their well and served in one of the suspicious pewter cups, Sarah claimed to be fasting for religious reasons and politely declined all food and drink during her overnight stay. She spent the night feigning sleep while listening to whispered conversations between the brothers in the cabin's loft, catching fragments of discussion about her traveling route, the contents of her wagon, and whether she might be missed if she failed to reach her destination in Arkansas. Brother, she heard Ezekiel whisper to Joshua in the darkness above her makeshift bed near the fireplace. The widow woman carries substantial funds, judging by the quality of her wagon and team. Claims to be traveling alone to Arkansas territory, no family expecting her on specific schedule. Weather should cover any traces if we act quickly, but Joshua had responded with unusual caution that may have saved Sarah's life. Something feels wrong about this one. She's too observant, asks too many questions about our neighbors and local settlements. Better to let her continue on and wait for easier prey. We've had good hunting lately and don't need to take unnecessary risks. Sarah remained awake throughout the night, her hand on the loaded pistol she carried in her traveling bag, ready to defend herself if the brothers decided to move against her. When dawn broke and the storm cleared, she thanked them profusely for their hospitality, while carefully noting landmarks and details about the cabin's location that would allow authorities to find the place if her suspicions proved correct. After reaching safety in Arkansas, Sarah reported her experiences to local law enforcement, but her account was dismissed as the overactive imagination of a nervous widow traveling alone through dangerous territory. It would not be until Thomas Weston's discovery in December 1867 that her testimony would be taken seriously, and her detailed descriptions of the cabin's interior and the brothers' behavior patterns would provide crucial corroborating evidence for the investigation. William Torres, a 32-year-old veteran of the Mexican-American War, encountered the brothers in March 1867 while traveling from his family's ranch in Texas to visit relatives in Illinois. His survival depended on military training that had taught him to recognize ambush situations and combat experience that enabled him to fight effectively despite being partially incapacitated by poison. Torres had served as a scout and had developed skills in reading terrain, assessing threats, and recognizing when situations were not what they appeared to be. When he arrived at the Stillwell cabin during a late winter snowstorm, his initial impression was positive. Two hard-working brothers offering hospitality to travelers in need. But subtle details began accumulating that triggered his military instincts and put him on guard. The brothers' cabin was positioned with excellent fields of fire covering all approach routes. Their horses were too fine for poor farmers, and both men carried weapons with the casual familiarity of experienced fighters rather than settlers who might occasionally need firearms for hunting or protection. Most tellingly, both brothers watched him with the calculating assessment that Torres recognized from soldiers evaluating enemy positions and capabilities. When Joshua served him coffee upon his arrival, Torres noticed that his own cup appeared different from those used by the brothers, slightly discolored on the interior and bearing residue that might have been medicine or some other substance. His military paranoia made him pretend to drink while actually spilling most of the liquid. But he consumed enough of the doctored coffee to begin experiencing symptoms that his medical training during the war allowed him to recognize as consistent with poisoning. The cramping in his stomach and the metallic taste in his mouth were familiar from occasions when he had treated soldiers who had consumed contaminated water or spoiled food. But the rapid onset and severity suggested deliberate poisoning rather than accidental contamination. Torres began preparing for combat while pretending that the poison was taking its intended effect, slumping in his chair and feigning increasing weakness while actually loosening his weapons and planning his response to whatever the brothers intended. When Ezekiel approached with a wooden club, apparently intending to finish what the poison had started, Torres exploded into action with the combat reflexes that had kept him alive through multiple battles in Mexico. Despite his partial incapacitation from the poison, he was able to wound Ezekiel with his Bowie knife and fight his way out of the cabin, escaping into the forest where his tracking, skills, and knowledge of concealment allowed him to evade pursuit until he was far enough away to reach safety. Torres reported his experience to authorities in Springfield, Missouri, providing detailed descriptions of the brothers and their cabin's location, along with his assessment that they were operating a systematic murder operation targeting travelers. Like Sarah Mitchell, his initial reports were met with skepticism, but his military service record and reputation for reliability ensured that his account was documented in official records that would later corroborate other evidence. James Crawford, a traveling Methodist minister, survived his encounter with the brothers in August 1867 through religious conviction that led him to refuse all food and drink during what he declared a period of spiritual fasting. His survival provided the most detailed account of the brothers' disposal methods, as his night-long vigil allowed him to witness them processing the remains of other victims who had not been as fortunate. Crawford had been traveling through the Ozarks conducting revival meetings in remote settlements when a series of thunderstorms forced him to seek shelter at the Stillwell cabin. His religious calling made him accustomed to accepting hospitality from strangers while maintaining the spiritual disciplines that he believed were essential to his ministry, including periodic fasting that involved abstaining from all food and drink except water drawn from natural sources. When the brothers offered him their standard welcome refreshments, Crawford politely explained that he was observing a spiritual fast and would accept only shelter from the storm while continuing his religious disciplines. This put the brothers in an awkward position, as insisting that he break his religious observance might have aroused suspicion, while allowing him to remain in their cabin without consuming poison created risks to their operation. Brother Elias, Brother Jeremiah, Crawford had addressed them using the religious titles common among frontier Christians. I'm grateful for your Christian charity in offering shelter to a stranger, but my spiritual discipline requires that I abstain from all sustenance except what the Lord provides through natural sources. I hope you will not take offense at my inability to share your table during this period of devotion. The brothers had little choice but to accept his explanation. Though Crawford noticed, they seemed unusually nervous and made frequent whispered consultations while he conducted his evening prayers and Bible readings near their fireplace. His ministerial experience in reading people's spiritual conditions made him sensitive to deception and evil, and he gradually recognized that something profoundly wrong existed within the cabin's atmosphere. During the night, Crawford witnessed the brothers dragging what appeared to be a human body from an outbuilding behind the cabin, working by lantern light to process the remains with butchering tools before hanging portions of flesh in what he initially assumed was their smokehouse. His horror at realizing he was witnessing evidence of murder and cannibalism was tempered by his religious training, which had prepared him to confront evil in its most extreme manifestations, while maintaining the spiritual strength necessary to bear witness and seek justice. Crawford remained in prayer throughout the night, asking for divine protection while memorizing every detail of what he observed. When morning came, he thanked the brothers for their hospitality while carefully noting landmarks and the specific location of their cabin. then made his way to the nearest settlement, where he reported his experiences to local authorities and documented his testimony in writing. The 3 survivors' accounts, when finally compiled during the investigation that followed Thomas Weston's discovery, provided crucial evidence about the brothers' methods, timeline of operations, and the systematic nature of their crimes. Their testimony established that the murders had been occurring over an extended period, that the brothers were using poison as their primary weapon, and that they were disposing of victims' remains through methods that involved processing human flesh for consumption. Most importantly, the survivors' reports provided law enforcement with detailed descriptions of the brothers' physical appearance, behavior patterns, and the cabin's location and layout. Information that would prove essential when authorities finally moved to investigate the site and gather physical evidence of the crimes. Their courage in reporting what they had witnessed, despite initial skepticism from authorities, ultimately ensured that the full scope of the brothers' activities would be documented and that their victims would not be entirely forgotten by history. On the morning of December 15, 1867, postal carrier Thomas Weston was making his regular route through the remote sections of Stone County, Missouri, when a sudden blizzard forced him to seek emergency shelter at the cabin that had served as the Stillwell brothers' murder factory for over 3 years. What Weston discovered inside that abandoned structure would expose one of the most systematic and grotesque murder operations in American frontier history, revealing evidence so disturbing that local authorities would struggle to comprehend the full scope of the atrocities that had been committed within those walls. Weston, a 34-year-old veteran of the Union Army who had taken the postal carrier position to support his wife Martha and their 2 young children, was no stranger to the harsh realities of frontier life. His military service during Sherman's march to the sea had exposed him to scenes of violence and death that would have traumatized civilian sensibilities. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he found when he forced open the door of the apparently abandoned Stillwell cabin. The storm had struck with unusual fury, transforming the mountain trails into impassable corridors of snow and ice that made continuing his postal route impossible until the weather cleared. Weston had visited the Stillwell cabin twice before during his regular deliveries, finding the brothers to be quiet but hospitable hosts who seemed genuinely grateful for news from the outside world and opportunities to send letters to distant relatives. But when he approached the cabin seeking shelter from the blizzard, Weston immediately noticed that something had changed dramatically since his last visit in November. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the bitter cold. No tracks marked the snow around the outbuildings, and most significantly, the front door stood slightly ajar, despite temperatures that would have made heating the interior impossible if the structure was not properly sealed. "Hello," Weston called out as he approached the cabin, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind that drove snow horizontally across the mountain clearing. "Elias, Jeremiah, I need shelter from this storm." But no response came from within, and when he pushed the door fully open and stepped inside, he found the cabin empty and cold as a tomb. The interior showed clear signs of hasty abandonment, with personal belongings scattered across the floor, furniture overturned, and most tellingly, the remains of a meal still sitting on the wooden table, as though the brothers had been interrupted in the middle of eating and had fled without taking time to clean up or secure their property. Plates contained partially consumed food that had frozen solid, while cups held the dregs of what appeared to be coffee or some other dark liquid. Weston's first concern was starting a fire to prevent himself from freezing to death during the storm. But as he gathered kindling from the woodpile beside the hearth, he made the first of several discoveries that would transform a simple search for shelter into a criminal investigation that would shock the entire region. Mixed among the split logs and kindling were human bones, Not just one or two that might be explained by accident or coincidence, but dozens of bones that had been broken and charred as though they had been used as fuel for the fireplace. Sweet Jesus, Weston whispered as he examined the unmistakable remains of human finger bones, ribs, and what appeared to be a section of human skull that bore the distinctive marks of deliberate fracturing. He had seen enough combat casualties to recognize human skeletal remains, and the quantity and condition of bones in the woodpile indicated that multiple people had died and been processed in ways that suggested systematic disposal rather than isolated incidents. His growing horror intensified as he explored the cabin more thoroughly, discovering additional evidence that the Stillwell brothers had been operating something far more sinister than a simple frontier inn. In a wooden chest beneath one of the beds, Weston found a collection of personal belongings that obviously represented multiple owners: jewelry, watches, money, weapons, and other valuables that would never have been accumulated by two poor farmers through legitimate means. More damning was the discovery of a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath loose floorboards, containing detailed records of what could only be described as a systematic murder operation. Joshua's careful handwriting documented victim after victim with notes about their possessions, their origins, their methods of disposal, and most disturbingly, evaluations of the quality and quantity of meat that had been harvested from their remains. Entry after entry revealed the calculated nature of the brothers. Crimes: November 3rd, 1866. Family from Ohio. Parents and 2 children. Used arsenic in evening meal. Total value approximately $150 in money and goods. Children provided excellent quality meat. Adults somewhat tough but acceptable for smoking. Disposed clothing in ravine. Buried bones in 3 locations. Another entry documented their complete desensitization to their victims' humanity. March 17, 1867, merchant from Memphis traveling to Arkansas, carried substantial gold hidden in wagon boards. Applied strychnine to drinking water. Death quick and clean. Subject was well-fed and healthy, provided superior cuts for preservation. Sold wagon and horses in Springfield using forged papers. But the most horrifying discoveries lay outside the main cabin, where Weston's investigation revealed the full scope of the brothers' atrocities. The well behind the cabin, which should have provided clean drinking water, had been turned into a disposal site for human remains. When Weston lowered a lantern into the depths, the light reflected off dozens of bones, skulls and other human remains that had been dumped into the water source over multiple years. The smokehouse behind the cabin contained evidence that confirmed the ledger's references to meat preservation and processing. Hanging from hooks and laid out on wooden racks were cuts of meat that Weston's military experience allowed him to recognize as human in origin, preserved through smoking and salt-curing techniques that demonstrated considerable knowledge of butchering and food preservation methods. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of a root cellar beneath the cabin's floor, accessible through a concealed trapdoor that had been carefully hidden beneath a heavy wooden chest. The underground chamber contained the preserved remains of what appeared to be the brothers' most recent victims, along with tools for butchering and processing human bodies, containers of various poisons and toxic substances, and additional ledgers documenting their experiments with different methods of murder and disposal. When the storm cleared on December 17th, Weston made his way as quickly as possible to the Stone County Sheriff's Office in Springfield, carrying with him several items of evidence, including pages from the murder ledger and samples of the suspicious substances he had found in the cabin. Sheriff James Whitmore, a veteran lawman who had dealt with various frontier crimes ranging from cattle rustling to claim jumping, initially struggled to believe Weston's account of what he had discovered. "Tom," Sheriff Whitmore said, as he examined the evidence that Weston had brought, "you're telling me that those 2 quiet brothers who've been living up there for 3 years have been poisoning and eating travelers? That's quite a story. and quite an accusation to make against men who've never caused any trouble that we've heard about. But the physical evidence was impossible to dismiss, and when Dr. Samuel Hayes, the county physician, examined the bone fragments and suspicious powders that Weston had collected, his findings confirmed the postal carrier's most horrific suspicions. The bones were definitely human, showing evidence of deliberate processing with sharp tools, while chemical analysis of the powders revealed arsenic, strychnine, and several other substances that could only have been intended for poisoning purposes. On December 20th, Sheriff Whitmore organized a full investigation team, including Deputy Marshal William Collins, Dr. Hayes, and 6 armed deputies to travel to the Stillwell cabin and conduct a complete examination of the property. What they found exceeded even Weston's disturbing account, revealing evidence of systematic murder on a scale that shocked hardened frontier lawmen who thought they had seen every form of human depravity. The investigation team spent 4 days cataloging evidence and exhuming remains from multiple burial sites around the property. Their final report documented the remains of at least 73 different individuals, along with possessions and personal effects that established many of the victims' identities and origins. The systematic nature of the murders, combined with the evidence of cannibalism and the brothers' careful record-keeping, painted a picture of calculated evil that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal behavior. But despite overwhelming evidence of their crimes, Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their abandoned meal and the question of whether they had fled to escape justice or had met with violence themselves. The mystery of their disappearance would remain unsolved, adding another layer of horror to a case that already represented one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. The investigation's findings would be documented in court records, newspaper accounts, and official reports that ensured the Hartley brothers' crimes would not be forgotten, even as the men themselves disappeared into the vast American frontier where new identities could be assumed and past atrocities hidden beneath facades of respectability and Christian virtue. Despite the overwhelming evidence of their systematic murder operation and the massive manhunt that followed the discovery of their crimes, Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley disappeared into the vast American frontier without a trace, leaving behind only questions about their ultimate fate and concerns that they might have continued their predatory activities in other locations, where desperate travelers could be lured to their deaths by the promise of sanctuary and hospitality. The investigation into their disappearance would span multiple states and territories, involve federal marshals and military authorities, and ultimately become one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in American law enforcement history. Sheriff James Whitmore coordinated the initial search efforts, organizing posses that scoured the Ozark wilderness for hundreds of square miles around the abandoned cabin, following every trail and checking every settlement where the brothers might have sought refuge or supplies for extended flight. The search teams included experienced trackers, former military scouts, and local hunters who knew the terrain intimately. But despite weeks of intensive effort, no definitive traces of the fugitives were discovered. The investigation revealed that the brothers had prepared extensively for the possibility of having to abandon their operation quickly. Hidden caches of money, weapons, and supplies were discovered at strategic locations throughout the region, suggesting they had planned multiple escape routes and had accumulated resources sufficient to sustain them during extended periods of hiding or travel. More significantly, evidence suggested they had established connections with networks of Confederate sympathizers who specialized in helping fugitives disappear into frontier communities where questions about the past were discouraged. Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer of the federal troops stationed at Fort Smith, Arkansas, reported that his patrols had encountered rumors of 2 men matching the Hartley brothers' descriptions traveling through the Indian Territory in late December 1867, but these reports were later dismissed when the alleged sightings could not be confirmed through direct contact. The wilderness of the Indian Territory provided perfect cover for fugitives seeking to disappear, with vast stretches of unmapped terrain, tribal jurisdictions that complicated law enforcement cooperation, and established networks of outlaws, and deserters who specialized in helping wanted men establish new identities. Judge Cornelius Banning, who presided over the legal proceedings that followed the discovery of the murders, declared the case officially unsolved after 6 months of intensive investigation had failed to locate the fugitives or determine their ultimate fate. The judge's final ruling established important legal precedents for frontier justice, while acknowledging the limitations of law enforcement in pursuing criminals who could exploit the vast distances and jurisdictional complexities of the American frontier. The court has examined extensive evidence proving beyond any reasonable doubt that Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley, operating under the assumed names of Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell, did systematically murder at least 73 innocent travelers who sought shelter at their cabin between 1864 and 1867, Judge Banning declared in his formal statement. The systematic nature of their crimes, their use of poison and deception, and their desecration of human remains through cannibalistic practices represent depths of depravity that shock the conscience of civilized society. However, the court must also acknowledge that despite the most extensive manhunt in this region's history, the perpetrators have evaded capture, and their current whereabouts remain unknown. Therefore, while we cannot bring these criminals to justice through legal execution, we can ensure that their crimes are thoroughly documented and that their victims are properly remembered and honored. The 3 survivors who had escaped the brothers' murderous hospitality, Sarah Mitchell, William Torres, and James Crawford, provided crucial testimony during the legal proceedings, describing their experiences in detail that corroborated the physical evidence found at the cabin. Their accounts established a clear pattern of predatory behavior that helped authorities understand how the brothers had operated and potentially identify similar cases that might be connected to their activities. Mrs. Mitchell's testimony was particularly valuable because her careful observations had documented details about the cabin's interior and the brothers' behavior that matched evidence discovered during the investigation. Her description of human bones mixed with animal remains and her instinctive recognition that something was fundamentally wrong with the brothers' hospitality provided important insights into how the murderers had operated. Torres's account of his near poisoning and violent escape demonstrated that the brothers were prepared to use direct violence when their poison methods failed, while his military training had enabled him to recognize the tactical aspects of their operation that civilian victims would have missed. His testimony established that the brothers were experienced fighters who had planned their murder operation with military precision. Crawford's religious perspective and his nighttime observations of the brothers processing human remains provided some of the most disturbing evidence about their cannibalistic practices, while his spiritual strength in bearing witness to such evil ensured that the full scope of their depravity would be documented for posterity. Dr. Samuel Hayes's forensic examination of the crime scene became one of the first comprehensive studies of systematic murder in American criminal investigation, establishing techniques for documenting mass murder sites that would influence law enforcement practices for decades. His detailed analysis of the human remains, poison residues, and other physical evidence provided scientific foundation for understanding how the brothers had operated their murder factory. The doctor's report concluded that the systematic nature of the murders, combined with evidence of long-term planning and sophisticated disposal methods, indicated that the Hartley brothers represented a new type of criminal that frontier society was unprepared to recognize or combat. His recommendations for improved communication between law enforcement agencies and better documentation of suspicious disappearances would eventually contribute to the development of more effective methods for tracking serial killers. In the years following the investigation, reports of similar poisoning murders surfaced sporadically throughout the frontier, from Texas to Montana, leading some investigators to theorize that the Hartley brothers had survived their flight and continued their predatory activities in other locations where isolated travelers could be lured to their deaths. However, none of these cases could be definitively linked to the Ozark murderers, and the brothers' ultimate fate remained a mystery that would persist for generations. The historical impact of the Hartley brothers' crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims and their region of operation. Their systematic approach to murder, their use of hospitality as a weapon, and their sophisticated methods of disposal influenced both criminal behavior and law enforcement response throughout the frontier period. Some historians believe their techniques and organizational methods inspired other murderous operations across the American West, making them pioneers in the development of systematic serial killing as a criminal enterprise. The cabin site itself became local legend, with occasional discoveries of additional bone fragments and personal belongings confirming that the brothers' documented victims represented only a portion of their total crimes. Local residents reported supernatural phenomena around the property, strange sounds, unexplained lights, and feelings of overwhelming dread that suggested the traumatic events had left permanent psychic scars on the landscape itself. In modern times, the story of the Poisoning Brothers has become part of Ozark folklore, commemorated in historical markers and local museums that document one of America's earliest cases of systematic serial murder. Criminal historians continue to study their methods and organization, finding parallels with later serial killers who would use similar techniques of deception and systematic disposal to claim multiple victims over extended periods. The three survivors lived to advanced ages, each carrying the trauma of their encounters with the brothers while finding purpose in ensuring that their experiences served as warnings about the potential for evil to hide behind facades of hospitality and Christian virtue. Their testimony became part of the historical record that preserved the memory of 73 innocent souls whose search for shelter had led them to one of the most horrific fates imaginable on the American frontier. The case of the Hartley brothers remains officially unsolved, a reminder that even the most extensive criminal investigations cannot guarantee justice when perpetrators have sufficient preparation and determination to disappear into the vast wilderness that characterized 19th century America. Their crimes stand as testimony to the vulnerability of isolated travelers and the potential for systematic evil to flourish in environments where law enforcement resources are limited and community oversight is minimal. Yet, their exposure also demonstrated the power of careful investigation and courageous testimony to document even the most horrific crimes, ensuring that victims are remembered and that the patterns of evil are preserved for future generations to study and, hopefully, prevent from recurring in new forms that exploit contemporary vulnerabilities and isolation.